The morning they finally fired me, the sky above the Titan Motors plant was the pale gray of old engine oil. The air out there smelled like metal shavings, mixed with that sharp ozone bite of industrial electricity. I had driven into the plant exactly the same way I always did. Windows rolled down, ignoring the freezing cold. Because I needed to hear my own truck's engine clearly, without any muffled distortion. I could tell you within the first 8 seconds of turning the key if the drive would run smooth, or if something tiny had shifted overnight in a way that desperately needed my attention. That morning my truck ran perfectly clean. That was the absolute last ordinary thing to happen to me for a long time. I had worked in engine diagnostics for 21 years. I started out on the floor of a regional auto repair shop in Cincinnati at 21. Learning the hard way, exactly how guys from my generation learned what actually mattered. Not from college courses, but through stubborn proximity and patience. I stood right next to older guys who knew better, soaking it all up in a way that most of them had completely stopped doing years before I even arrived. I never had a fancy engineering degree. I had something a college degree could not possibly produce. I could hear an engine breathing like a living thing, speaking its own language, and I understood what it was saying way before the shiny new computers caught up. By the time I finally joined Titan Motors 11 years ago, my reputation got there first in that quiet way word travels in specialized circles. No loud bragging, just the quiet fact that the engineers who really needed to know already knew. I had personally prevented a catastrophic valve failure at a Stuttgart hypercar plant just by spotting a harmonic resonance flutter in the exhaust 6 weeks before their fancy engineering sensors flagged a single thing. I had even caught a massive cooling system fault in a new prototype sports sedan that had already passed 3 different diagnostic reviews. I caught it because that defect hid as a tiny frequency shift that fell completely below the radar of every machine in that building, except for my own ears. I did all this quietly, without any big celebration and without formal documentation, because the people bringing me in never demanded useless paperwork. They only cared about results, and I always delivered them. At Titan Motors, Human Resources labeled me a senior technical specialist. It was a title vague enough to mean absolutely anything and empty enough to mean zero inside a corporate giant that dumped nearly $800 million into AI-driven diagnostic systems and fully automated quality control infrastructure. They completely gutted and redesigned the plant twice just to fit all that shiny new tech. Suddenly, the shop floors looked spotless, the robots moved quieter. Control room dashboards constantly glowed with an endless river of sensor data that updated itself 400 times a second, supposedly spotting driveshaft stress down to 3 tiny decimal places of tolerance. The guy running the AI diagnostic division, Julian Cross, always loved bragging that our factory had finally become the most precisely monitored manufacturing environment in the entire automotive world. He preached that exact line at every single meeting I attended. And the crazy part, he believed his own hype more every time. Sure, they spun that flawless narrative inside their annual corporate reports and slick investor pitches. Management handed out brochures claiming our shift to AI diagnostics represented the next logical step for auto manufacturing. They claimed precision mattered more than human sentiment. In their slick little story, guys like me weren't being erased. We were being elevated, freed from our flawed human senses, liberated to sit back and interpret the high-level data, instead of doing the dirty work of detection. Titan Motors told that lie well. The whole plant was redesigned to match it. Slick photos in their investor decks backed it up. For a while, the numbers even agreed. But here's what those spreadsheets couldn't show you, because numbers by their very nature only track what already happened, not what is right in the process of falling apart. They couldn't measure the truth I carried in my listening. 21 years standing inside loud running machines. Learning their language through sweat and patience gave me something no algorithm had. No matter how fancy it was, could ever hope to replicate. I could hear exactly what a motor was doing right now and exactly what it was about to do. This wasn't some magic trick. It was my brain catching patterns way sharper than any shiny new diagnostic tool could. Built on decades of grease and steel, giving me a gut feeling that was always right. I couldn't explain it using the fancy tech jargon Julian Cross and his engineering team threw into their specs. And I stopped trying to years ago. I just knew what my ears caught, and I was always dead right about it. But here on the modern Titan Motors factory floor, my hard-earned intuition had quietly become the one thing management wanted out of their way. I have a 10-year-old son named Noah. He didn't get my quiet nature, and he sure didn't get my restraint. But the boy completely and unmistakably inherited my deep obsession with the specific noises engines make when they run right and when they fail. He was only 4 years old when my wife, Rebecca, died from an aneurysm in our kitchen just 30 minutes east of the auto plant. She was just making coffee. The pot finished brewing before either of us knew something was wrong. I've raised my boy alone in that exact same house ever since. And I did it with the same quiet, steady rhythm, pouring the same careful attention into him that I brought to the assembly line every single day. He goes to school, he eats his dinner. I listen to him speak, I correct his mistakes, and I hold him accountable for the little things. Because if you ask me, the small details are where character gets built. My son loves bragging to strangers that his old man can hear a car defect better than any computer could. He always says it with the pure certainty of a kid who hasn't yet figured out that real authority needs fancy corporate degrees to be respected, completely unaware why a piece of paper should matter to anyone. The new Aurora X had been Titan Motors' biggest gamble for 3 years. A flashy hybrid electric vehicle, powertrain built on a platform that our marketing executives branded as the perfect mix of high performance and responsibility. A useless tagline approved by 17 executives across 4 different departments, stripping away every single trace of actual truth in the process. We'd been running tests on this prototype for 8 solid months. Launch day was 7 weeks out, the big investor pitch just 11 days. You could feel the tension out on the floor. Everyone knew the window for bringing up any kind of problem had completely slammed shut. And God help anybody who brought up a new defect now. Management would never forgive them. I stepped onto the test floor at 6:47 that morning, the very day they fired me. 90 minutes before my shift even started. I always clock in early. I'd spend that first hour just standing right next to the machines in the dead quiet long before the daily chaos started. I didn't carry scanners, never trusted gadgets during that first hour anyway. Diagnostics are really only helpful once you already know where to look. You and I both know if you rely entirely on screens, they'll just blind you with completely unquestionable false confidence. I stood beside the Aurora X prototype for 12 full minutes. The engine was idling low. It hummed so smooth and steady, most rookies would swear they were hearing pure silence. But I definitely didn't hear silence. I caught it the way a veteran musician catches a string playing slightly flat. Not like the whole engine was broken, but as a warning sign. Something deep inside the guts wasn't lining up right. It finally hit my ears at minute 7. A hiccup so incredibly tiny, it lasted barely a fraction of a second during the engine's rotation. A slight pressure drop in the secondary thermal chamber. It shifted the pitch so damn quietly that no one else would have even heard it if they weren't actively hunting for it. I always catch these things. I'm always listening for the one noise that shouldn't be there. Because after 20 years turning wrenches, I knew perfectly well the tiny details that feel out of place are usually the ones that actually matter most. I called a dead stop on the morning run at 7:12 before the hotshot executive Julian Cross even arrived, long before upper management checked their daily schedules. My floor boss, Dennis, a solid guy with 9 years on the assembly line who actually trusted my gut feelings enough to take them seriously, pushed my halt request up the corporate chain without complaining. Julian rolled in at 7:38, driving a slick car that cost 4 times more than my old truck. He parked in a shiny spot they paved just for executives about 6 months back. The kid was barely 34 with the smug swagger of a guy who's been told his entire life that he was the smartest guy in the room, and he never once doubted his genius. His fancy artificial intelligence division hit their profit targets for 3 straight quarters. The kid actually got his quarterly reports laminated and beautifully framed. Up in his office, I noticed them once but never said a word about it. Julian glared at the stopped line, sneered right at me, then checked his precious monitors. The sensors showed green across every single system, and he gave me, you know the look. That fake polite smile a boss forces when they're secretly boiling mad. Our systems show a clean run, he said, every parameter within specification. There is a pressure variance in the secondary thermal chamber. I told him straight. Tonal shift on the pressure cycle. 6-point-something milliseconds recurring. Julian checked the monitors again, then looked back at me. He had that forced theatrical patience, strictly playing to the crowd. The AI tracks 400 data points simultaneously. If there was a pressure drop, we'd definitely know. We'd know exactly when it became large enough for the sensors to catch. I'm warning you what this becomes before it ever reaches that point. You're saying you heard something our equipment missed? Is that right, Caleb? He said my name like a weapon, hoping the pure condescension would do all the heavy lifting for his argument. We've got 7 weeks until launch. The investor pitch is in 11 days. We aren't stopping prototype testing just because you think you heard a noise. I just stared at the prototype. I studied it the way I always study engines, no blind awe, no useless sentiment. Just the intense focus of someone translating a complex mechanical language that the suits around me couldn't even begin to speak. In 72 hours, I told them, the thermal variance will fry that primary coupling. That coupling breaks. Then the failure rips right through the entire production line. A long silence followed, gripping the entire room. Floor workers suddenly found extremely urgent reasons to stare at anything except me or Julian. That's completely impossible, Julian snapped. The design features specific redundancies built entirely to prevent cascade failures. Those safeguards only track what your sensors can measure, I shot back. The defect I'm describing hides completely below that threshold. CEO Victoria Sterling walked in at 8:15, way early, meaning Dennis or someone else must have sent word upstairs. 39 years old, she'd been running the entire show at Titan Motors for 3 years now. Installed by a desperate board looking for a ruthless leader. Someone to make this Aurora X launch the absolute obsession of the company's future. Victoria wasn't a reckless leader at all. She bet the company's entire strategy on the Aurora X only after heavy analysis. She moved forward knowing exactly what a catastrophic failure at this critical stage would cost. And that massive pressure meant stepping back right now was a luxury she just couldn't afford. She quietly listened to my warning for 6 minutes. Then she stared at me with the cold, tired look of someone completely trapped, forced into making an incredibly brutal call and deciding she'd rather just swing the axe cleanly today than drag out the bleeding. Mr. Turner, she started quietly. I know you possess strong instincts, and I really appreciate how valuable they've been in the past. But stopping production on this prototype over a noise our AI systems haven't confirmed, we can't do it. The launch schedule won't budge. With all due respect, I told her, a rigid schedule won't stop what's coming. Victoria met my gaze for a second. Her face didn't even harden up. It just locked into place the way a brutal decision settles once the ink dries. Your position at this specific facility is officially terminated today. Human Resources will hand over the relevant exit paperwork. You're welcome to fight this through the usual channels. She took a brief pause. I'm sorry it ended this way. She sounded totally sincere, which honestly just made it much worse. The fallout from that exact moment stuck with everyone on the factory floor quite differently. It all depended on how much they had riding on that final outcome. Dennis, our floor supervisor, stared hard at the concrete. 2 techs over by the East Assembly Bay suddenly found their clipboards fascinating. Julian Cross kept that smug look of a boss who felt vindicated without quite getting the real satisfaction he assumed beating me would provide. I reached into my greasy work jacket and pulled out my factory access badge. I placed it on the equipment table beside me, no big dramatic show. No slamming doors, just the steady precision I brought to the assembly line. I stared at that flawed car prototype one last time. I wasn't angry and I wasn't defeated. It was the stare of a guy who spoke the hard truth, got heard loud and clear but ignored. And I knew exactly what kind of disaster was coming down the pipeline next. I grabbed my heavy toolbox from the floor near the workstation. Just a beat-up metal case. I've swapped out those latches twice already. Scratched to hell, holding the scars of 20 hard years on the floor. Inside were my tools. I kept them perfectly tuned, just like a surgeon's instruments. Not because they cost a lot, but because trusting them was the foundation of every single job I touched. I walked straight toward the exit without glancing back once. My boy Noah was waiting by the gate. School hadn't even started yet. I had texted him earlier to hang tight instead of catching the morning bus. He sat on that brick wall near the parking lot, balancing some paperback novel right on his knee, jacket wide open in the freezing morning cold, totally lost in the book, like he always did with his interests. He glanced up when I walked through the gate. Whatever he saw on my face made him snap the book shut. They didn't listen, Noah told me. It wasn't even a question. No, they didn't, I replied. He just stared at me for a second. The kid was only 10 years old, but he'd been dealing with harsh, grown-up realities since he was 4. It aged him fast, the deep, quiet maturity that only comes when a child goes through real loss. He wasn't bitter or hardened. He just paid close attention to reality. What are we going to do? He asked. What we always do, I said. Head home, figure out the next step. He took that in stride. He hopped off the low wall and matched my pace as we headed over to the pickup truck. After a few steps, he muttered, "Engine still sounds good at least." I just looked down at him. I felt a little twitch on my face, not quite a full smile, but occupying the same space. Yeah, I told him, the truck is fine. Neither of us said the obvious part, because we didn't really need to. My gut feeling about that busted prototype wasn't going to vanish just because management fired me. Sure, I've made mistakes before. Anyone sweating the tiny tolerances on an assembly line gets it wrong sometimes. But as I steered away from the Titan plant that morning, the heavy feeling in my chest wasn't doubt. It was the grim, silent dread of a guy watching a time bomb tick down. Back inside, the Titan motors sped up. Victoria signed off on extending the daily automotive test runs, tacking 4 extra hours onto the afternoon shift to cover my morning interruption. Julian's crew cranked the safety limits higher, filtering out what he stubbornly called background noise in the thermal data. A reckless decision made with the smug confidence of a boss trusting screens instead of a veteran. That production floor ran at absolute capacity. You and I both know that sound, the plant's deep hum pushing an untested vehicle line way past its breaking point. 36 hours after they fired me, a night shift technician named Marcus caught a weird vibration in the southern test bay, something he definitely did not recognize. Marcus had been walking that factory floor for 4 years. 2 of those on nights. He had that sharp sixth sense you only get from the graveyard shift. A job needing extreme attention in a building full of echoing, repetitive noise. The shake was so faint, he honestly wasn't sure if he was feeling it or just losing his mind. He logged it as a minor anomaly in the night report and kept doing his job. The morning shift caught the exact same vibration. 6 hours later, it was noticeably, measurably stronger. But Julian's software called it acceptable. Why? Because management had quietly raised the safety limits, and the shaking just hadn't tripped their shiny, new, dangerous threshold yet. Stick with me here. Julian's engineers actually saw it, but decided warning him would spark corporate drama they simply didn't want to touch. Victoria was busy running back-to-back investor calls. Dennis, our usual floor supervisor, the one guy who might have escalated things, was on a scheduled day off he couldn't cancel. So the Aurora X prototype kept burning through its 48th hour of extended testing. It ran with that blind confidence of a machine being told it's perfectly fine by every broken sensor measuring it. At 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, on the 3rd day after they canned me, the primary thermal coupling on the Aurora X finally gave out. It wasn't some massive Hollywood explosion, but trust me, it was plenty violent. A critical engine part built to control massive heat transfer between the 2 main systems finally hit an absolute breaking point. It was never built to take that heat, so it died. It failed the way cheap metal always fails when you push it too hard for too long, absolutely catastrophically, venting all that pent-up energy in one single, violently uncontrolled blast. Guys heard the crack across 3 separate buildings. The automated fire suppression kicked in under 4 seconds. The emergency shutdown ripped down the assembly line with the cold, mechanical certainty of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, which was to kill every machine. The massive production floor lights dropped to a dim emergency glow. Welding robots locked in place, conveyor belts jerked dead mid-cycle. The facility control room flashed with alarms, blinking in that harsh red-orange color that screamed things had moved way past monitoring and needed immediate saving. 2 safety officers bolted onto the scene within 7 minutes. And what they found was a factory floor that had, in mere moments, turned into a dead, multi-million-dollar graveyard of frozen machines, reeking of sharp chemical fire foam. Management called Julian Cross at 2:22 in the morning. He finally reached the plant at 3:15. On the drive, he ignored 4 calls from panicked senior engineers and 1 from Victoria's assistant. He probably spent the entire drive inventing a sequence of slick excuses that, as you can guess, instantly fell apart the second he saw the massive wreckage. Victoria Sterling arrived at 3:50. She paced the dead production floor in total silence for 6 minutes. I heard she just stood there, staring at the blown coupling, at the dead assembly line, staring at the control room monitors, which were finally showing her the plain, ugly truth. No room for management spin anymore. The failure cascade was playing out exactly how I warned them. Thermal variance, pressure spikes, coupling stress, and a full structural collapse. She just stood there in the control room, staring at the factory metrics, completely silent for a long time. Arthur Hayes, the big boss of the Titan Motors investor group, rolled up by 7 a.m. A stern guy in his 60s. You and I know the type. 40 years watching arrogant suits make expensive manufacturing mistakes because they ignored the workers. The hard truth always catches up eventually. He walked the factory floor flanked by 2 corporate associates. He asked the hard questions, and he actually listened. He checked the repair bills, hundreds of millions, once they added up the massive cascade damage ripping through our entire production line infrastructure. He reviewed their glossy investor timeline and then stared at the ruined launch schedule. Finally, he read the preliminary morning reports from our own engineering guys, proving the massive defect started in the exact spot I had warned them about, and spiraled into a total disaster exactly like I predicted. Then the chairman asked just one single question. He didn't care about the broken engineering, and he didn't care about the delays. "Where is Turner?" I was out in my garage when Victoria's expensive car pulled up. Just a modest single-car structure attached right to the side of the house. My boy Noah and I spent 2 years of weekends building it into a workspace. It isn't huge, but I keep it organized with the exact strict precision I bring to everything. You and I both know the feeling of a quiet space where you're entirely in your element. My tools hung on pegboard in the very deliberate order. I could grab whatever wrench I needed, even in the dark. A cheap shop lamp threw bright, clean light across my workbench. I painted that concrete floor gray 3 years back. Even the tight corners were still spotless. I was swapping an alternator on a neighbor's old sedan, doing the labor as a quick favor for just $30. Far less than the job was worth, but still about all the poor guy could afford. My boy Noah sat on a wooden stool tucked over in the corner, doing his school homework, with a heavy textbook leaning up against my toolbox. He glanced up when that fancy vehicle parked outside and just quietly watched. The door swing open. He gave it that sharp, analyzing stare he definitely picked up from me. He sized up the car first, the expensive make, the slick paint, the rushed parking job. Then he watched the executive stepping out, before finally turning his eyes back over to me. I hadn't even bothered looking up from that engine block, but my shoulders tensed up. Noah knew my body language whenever I sensed an outsider stepping onto my turf. Victoria Sterling marched up my driveway. She wasn't wearing her usual pristine high-level corporate boardroom suit. She was still wearing whatever wrinkled clothes she threw on at 3 in. The morning when that disaster call hit, she hadn't changed, and she honestly just looked like a boss who just spent hours facing the crushing reality of a mistake she could never undo. I finally locked eyes with her from under the hood of that beat-up sedan. I let her stand there in silence. "We need your help," she pleaded. I stared her down for a beat. "I know, the thermal coupling failed. You know that look? The cascade pattern matched your warning." She paused. "I owe you an acknowledgement before I ask for anything. You were dead right. We really should have listened." I slammed the sedan's hood shut and wiped my grease-stained hands on a shop rag. I just stared at her. Honestly, I'd been waiting for this day, but I wasn't surprised it finally came, and I honestly felt zero satisfaction. "What's the factory line status?" I asked. "Shut down. The automated diagnostics are feeding us conflicting data about the secondary damage," she admitted. "You can't see what's salvageable because those sensors were never built to catch that failure," I told her. "No," I folded my rag. I glanced over at my boy Noah. He watched from his stool, giving us that steady focus. A silent look passed between us, no words, no gestures. Just that deep understanding you only get from years of learning each other's quiet spaces. "The fancy systems you have won't tell you what matters," I pointed out. "I can tell you what's broken." "I know," she replied. "Then let's get moving." Victoria scanned my garage, taking in the neat tools and the neighbor's beat-up car. She stared at Noah sitting quietly with his textbook, and she took it all in like she was seeing a completely alien world, far different from the corporate life she knew. "My assistant can arrange," she began. "I'll drive my own truck," I cut in. I stepped inside the house and came back 3 minutes later wearing my worn jacket. I told Noah to call if he needed anything. He promised me he would. He spoke with the complete unbothered calm of a kid who has held down the fort plenty of times before. He knew his old man was coming back, just like I always did. Victoria watched us, a strange, uncomfortable emotion flickering across her face that she couldn't hide. She quickly turned back toward her expensive ride, giving us a second of true privacy. I pulled up to the Titan plant 40 minutes later. Drove my own truck, parked out in the main lot. I walked through those main doors lugging the exact same battered toolbox I'd hauled out 48 hours prior. And the folks on the production floor who saw me reacted differently, completely depending on how much of the truth they actually knew. Dennis had canceled his day off and been grinding on site since 4 in the morning. He met me right at the bay entrance and just said, "Good to have you back." He said it like a guy who meant every single word. A few fellow technicians who'd been working the line during the initial disaster nodded at me with genuine heavy relief. We've all been there, waiting for the guy management should have heard on day one. Julian Cross stood by the control monitors. He didn't say a damn word when I walked past. The suit looked completely gutted, staring like a man who just lost something he couldn't even name. And honestly, that's always the most expensive kind of loss. I marched to the center of the assembly floor and stood dead still for 2 minutes. The emergency alarm systems were still partially blaring. The whole plant sounded different now, eerily quiet here, jarring and irregular there. We've all heard it, a broken machine stuck mid-cycle, blindly waiting for what comes next. I just stood and listened. I paced slowly down the assembly line, pausing at 3 spots, leaning close without touching the machinery. Just listening with the deep focus of a guy reading fine print. At the 3rd stop, I crouched beside a secondary coupling module in the east section and listened closely for 20 seconds. Then I stood up and looked at the engineering suits who had gathered at a safe distance. "The main failure point is documented," I told them. "But you've got a secondary stress fracture in that eastern module. It's hidden. Your fancy sensors miss it because the crack is in the internal bore, not the outer housing. Restart this line without swapping it out, and the cycle load snaps it in about 3 to 4 hours flat." Claire, the senior member of the engineering crew, heard me. She'd been at the plant 12 years. She just looked at Julian. Julian stared at his monitoring screens. They showed absolutely zero issues out east. He glared back at me. "On what basis?" Julian started. "Pull the module," Claire ordered flatly. She spoke softly, carrying the heavy finality of someone who knows exactly what happens when management ignores the veteran on the factory floor. "We'll examine it." So the module was pulled. Taking it off the line ate up 40 solid minutes. Her team snaked a fiber optic scope inside that internal bore. There was the fracture. It was tiny. The scope needed 2 full passes just to confirm it. But it was big enough, given the Aurora X cycle loads, to crash the module in the exact time frame I had warned them about. The entire production floor got dead quiet. In that moment, a hard truth that had been real for years finally became undeniably visible to all the executives who worked so hard to stay blind. Arthur Hayes had been hovering quietly near the control room door. Watching the module examination, he spoke first. He talked quietly, zero drama. Just a guy admitting something that was undeniably obvious all along. The AI system didn't prevent this failure. It completely missed the diagnosis. It never spotted the secondary defect. Caleb prevented this disaster, and we fired him for it. He locked eyes with Julian. I want a full accounting of every diagnostic threshold adjustment made in the 48 hours before that failure. He paused, every single one, bring me timestamps and authorization logs. Julian opened his mouth to reply. Arthur just raised a hand. That tiny gesture killed the excuse before it even started. It took me 11 hard days to work, right through the entire diagnostic assessment of the vehicle line. I worked right alongside Claire's team. The working relationship we built felt like a real collaboration between people who had always fought on the exact same side but somehow never occupied the same room at the same time. Claire was sharp and thorough. She had zero interest in any explanation except the honest truth. Her engineers treated me with that quiet respect you only earn by proving you know your trade, which is a totally different and far more durable kind of respect than any corporate title buys. When we compiled the total damage assessment, the scope was significantly wider than Victoria had prayed for, yet a bit less catastrophic than she feared. 3 whole sections of the production line needed major rework. You know how it is. That prototype was salvageable, but our launch schedule took a hard 9-week hit. Management quickly rescheduled the investor presentation. Those major investors expressed some serious concern. Arthur Hayes handled those panicked calls with that same patient, straight-shooting style he always used. The talks were brutal, but we survived them. Titan Motors didn't collapse entirely, which honestly was the worst-case scenario staring us right down. But our immediate future had shifted drastically, and every single suit upstairs knew it well. Something else changed too, though much quieter. It was how the folks inside finally started understanding things. Julian Cross somehow kept his executive job, but they completely gutted his division's authority. Those fancy AI diagnostic systems became regular instruments, not the final judge. Just tools pointing out where we should look, instead of almighty systems claiming to know the absolute truth. They never publicly called it a demotion, obviously. Because saving face is a currency these massive companies spend constantly and completely invisibly. But on the production floor, we all understood perfectly. Victoria requested a sit-down with me on the 12th day after the diagnostic checks finished up and our heavy production line rework officially began. She met me in a second-floor conference room, keeping me entirely out of her office. I caught that detail immediately. I knew it was a deliberate choice, not coincidence. She had a solid proposal. She laid it right out without any fluff. She wanted me taking a brand new role, Director of Technical Integrity. Stick with me here. That specific position had never existed inside Titan Motors before. And honestly, the fancy title meant far less to me than the function. My job was building a human-led diagnostic protocol alongside the AI, holding explicit authority to halt any testing or manufacturing process based on manual findings that those automated systems completely missed. The position offered a salary that was, by absolutely any realistic measure, a massive upgrade from my old blue-collar paycheck. It included real benefits and the legally binding power to finally do the exact thing I had tried to warn them about and been fired over. I listened to her full proposal carefully before I gave my response, which is exactly how I've always listened to absolutely everything. I'll take the role, I told her. One condition. Victoria patiently waited. The line techs who flagged the defect before failure, that night shift worker. Those 2 young engineers on your squad who didn't escalate because they feared management's backlash. They all need to know their gut instincts were right. And they need to know that raising those concerns in the future is not just permitted, but absolutely required. I looked her right in the eye. The real problem wasn't just what your fancy computer systems missed. It was that your own floor workers didn't feel safe speaking up. Victoria just stared at me for a moment. She slowly nodded, wearing that look of someone finally facing a hard truth they secretly knew all along. I'll address it, she said quietly. In writing, I fired back. Hard policy, not just conversation. In writing, she agreed. I accepted the role. Noah finally visited the Titan Auto facility for the first time one Saturday morning, 3 weeks after my official return. The production floor was running super light that weekend. so foot traffic was low enough to safely walk around without causing any major disruptions. I walked him through the facility myself. Picture this. I showed my boy Noah everything that mattered, wordlessly. I just let the car plant speak through its own sounds. We stopped whenever an assembly station sounded interesting. I let Noah just stand there and listen until he was finished. I never bothered explaining what the manufacturing machines were doing or their true underlying purpose. I let Noah experience them purely as sound first. It's exactly how I learned machinery, a raw language that comes before formal understanding. Something you must hear before it can ever be truly known. Noah asked very few questions. That was unusual for him normally, but put him around heavy machinery, and he became quieter than he was anywhere else. I always understood that silence as a sign of deep, genuine attention, rather than just him being a passive kid. As we walked through the Eastern Auto production bay, Noah paused twice to listen to certain things that I had already heard, mentally logging them into my ongoing assessment of the new line's recovery. I didn't question Noah about either sound. The real purpose of our factory visit was not about evaluation. The actual reason we were there was much simpler than that. To let my son see where I worked and to understand exactly what that daily work really was. Right near the middle of the main production floor, Noah suddenly stopped and tilted his head to one side. It was a gesture so familiar I recognized it before I even knew the cause. "What is it?" I asked him. "Something in that conveyor," Noah replied. He pointed straight toward the eastern bay. "A kind of rattle, it's very small." I quietly listened. I caught it on the second cycle. A minor misalignment in the conveyor tensioner, nothing too significant right now. But the exact kind of defect that builds up under cycle loads and becomes highly significant later. I looked down at my son. He was standing with his head still tilted, just listening closely. "Good ear," I told him. Noah looked up at me with that classic look, a boy who was just told something he already knew, but was still pleased to hear it confirmed anyway. "You taught me," he simply said. We stood together for another few minutes, soaking in the particular silence of a car production floor mid-cycle. Just listening together to a machine that was, for the moment, doing exactly what it was built to do. Later that same week, I submitted a formal maintenance notice on that eastern conveyor tensioner. Claire's team found that exact misalignment on their very first inspection. The adjustment took 20 minutes. Nothing was interrupted at all. Meanwhile, up in Arthur Hayes's office on the 37th floor of Titan Motors' corporate headquarters. You know the type of building, sight lines stretching on clear days to the very edge of the sprawling city. There was an old filing system that his assistant maintained with the extreme thoroughness of someone who truly understands that a corporation's memory is its primary asset. Among all the files sitting in that system, reclassified right after the Aurora X incident from inactive personnel archive to active operations reference, was a folder bearing a tab with my name, Caleb Turner. Tucked inside that folder was a single page of internal correspondence, dated straight from the year I first joined the car company, written by the facility director who processed my original job application. The page held a strict summary assessment of my professional qualifications. It bluntly acknowledged that my formal credentials didn't meet the standard requirements for the engineering position, and a strong recommendation that I be hired regardless, all based on the unusual specificity of the raw skills I demonstrated during the Canon 2250 evaluation process. Picture this. Right beneath the formal recommendation on my file sat a quick handwritten note. Our big boss, Arthur Hayes, read it right after the new tech director was confirmed. He dropped that paper on his heavy mahogany desk, staring quietly for a moment before shutting my personnel folder. The label just read, "Internal Note. The sharpest engine diagnostic specialist this car plant has ever tested." Hayes actually wrote those exact words himself 11 years ago, back when he still directed our factory advisory board and personally reviewed new hires like me. He'd completely forgotten he ever wrote that. But staring at my file today, we both know the truth. His early instinct was dead right. Meanwhile, down in the employee parking lot, my old pickup idled in the fading afternoon light. I just sat there with the window down, listening to the motor hum like always. The engine turned over perfectly, clean, even, and honest, exactly how a machine should sound. I finally dropped it into gear and drove home to my boy.